They say love is blind, but looking back now, I think I was willingly turning a blind eye. My marriage to Laura felt like a dream in the beginning. Effortless conversations, shared dreams, and a spark that lit up my life in a way I'd never experienced before. We had what most people would call a perfect setup. A beautiful home in the suburbs, steady careers that kept us comfortable, and a son, Ethan, who I adored more than anything. I thought we had it all. I thought we were happy. But happiness has a way of masking the truth. And the cracks in our relationship started appearing before I could admit to myself they were even there. At first, they were subtle. Laura coming home later than usual, brushing off my questions with vague excuses. Work ran late, she'd say with a forced smile. Had to run errands, she'd mutter, avoiding my gaze. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? That's what trust is, isn't it? Giving someone the benefit of the doubt, even when you feel the whisper of something being off. It wasn't just the late nights. The changes were everywhere once I started paying attention. She seemed distracted even when she was with me, her laughter hollow, her affection perfunctory. We used to talk for hours about Ethan, about our plans for the future, about nothing at all. But those conversations dwindled, replaced by one-word answers and an air of tension that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then there was her phone. It became her constant companion, more than it had ever been before. She'd keep it face down on the counter, close apps the moment I walked into the room, and guard it as if it held the secrets of the universe. I remember laughing it off to a friend once, joking that Laura was probably hiding her Pinterest addiction. But deep down, it gnawed at me. Why was she acting like this? I wanted to believe her excuses. I told myself she was stressed, that maybe she needed space. After all, we'd been married for 8 years. Wasn't it normal for things to shift over time? I clung to the hope that this was just a rough patch, the kind all couples go through. I reminded myself that we had weathered storms before and come out stronger. This would be no different, or so I thought. It was Ethan who kept me grounded during those early days when my gut told me something was wrong, but my heart refused to accept it. Watching him grow, hearing him call me Dad, seeing the way his face lit up when I walked through the door, it was enough to keep me fighting for my marriage. I told myself that whatever was going on, we'd get through it for him. I couldn't imagine my life without either of them, and I didn't want to try. But life has a cruel way of making us face the truths we try to bury. And while I was busy convincing myself that everything would go back to normal, I had no idea my life was already beginning to unravel. The truth was out there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment I couldn't ignore it any longer. And when it finally came, it hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just about Laura staying late at work or spending too much time on her phone. It wasn't just about her distant behavior or the excuses that didn't add up. It was about the lies I didn't even know I was living, the lies that would tear my world apart. I thought I had a family. I thought I had a marriage worth saving. But the truth? The truth was something I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. Everything I thought I knew was a lie, and the cracks in my marriage weren't just cracks. They were fault lines, ready to shatter everything in one devastating blow. The moment I discovered the truth wasn't some grand revelation. It started small, like most betrayals do. A single thread pulled loose, unraveling the life I thought I had. It was a Saturday morning, and Laura was in the shower. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a sound that had become irritatingly familiar. It buzzed constantly these days, a stream of texts, emails, and who knows what else. I usually ignored it. I wanted to trust her, and snooping wasn't something I ever imagined doing. But that morning, something inside me shifted. The screen lit up, and I saw a name. Mark. My brother-in-law. It wasn't unusual for Laura to be in touch with Mark. After all, he was married to her twin sister, Kate. But this text wasn't about family plans or casual conversation. The preview read, "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about," and then it cut off. My stomach sank. I stared at the phone, willing it to make sense. Maybe I was misreading it. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. I picked up the phone, hands trembling, and unlocked it. The rest of the message confirmed what I didn't want to believe. It was graphic, intimate, a confession of a relationship that had no business existing. And it wasn't just one message. There were dozens stretching back months, filled with plans, declarations of love, and discussions about Ethan. That was the moment I realized the full weight of the betrayal. Ethan, my son, the boy I had raised, loved, and devoted my life to. They spoke about him as if he were theirs. And then, in one devastating sentence, Mark wrote, "I hate lying to him. He doesn't deserve this." I couldn't breathe. My hands felt numb as I scrolled through more messages, each one a dagger to the heart. It wasn't just an affair. It was a life they had built behind my back. My wife, my brother-in-law, and my son. Everything I thought was mine wasn't mine at all. I heard the water turn off in the bathroom. Panic surged through me. I locked the phone and put it back on the counter, retreating to the living room like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. My world had collapsed in the span of 5 minutes. When Laura walked in, wrapped in a towel, smiling like nothing was wrong, I felt an overwhelming wave of anger and heartbreak. I wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand answers, to scream, to cry. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed time to process, to think, to figure out what to do next. So I stayed silent, watching her go about her morning routine as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence was unbearable. I spent the rest of that day trying to act normal, which felt impossible with the weight of what I'd just discovered pressing down on me. Every glance at Laura made my stomach churn. How could she walk around so casually, so unaffected, while I was drowning in betrayal? I kept telling myself to wait, to think this through, but by nightfall, the dam broke. It was after dinner. Ethan had gone to bed, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the dishwasher. Laura was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, probably texting him. That thought alone lit a fire in my chest. I couldn't keep it in anymore. "We need to talk," I said, my voice tight. She looked up, startled by my tone. "What's wrong?" It was almost laughable, her acting so innocent. I stood there, my heart pounding, hands shaking. "Mark," I said, the name heavy on my tongue. "How long has it been going on?" For a split second, her face froze. It was subtle, just a flicker of something in her eyes, but I saw it. Then she recovered, shaking her head. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me, Laura." I snapped, my voice louder now. "I saw the text. I know about you and Mark." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You went through my phone?" she finally said, deflecting like it was the real crime here. "How could you? Don't you dare turn this around on me!" I yelled, my voice echoing through the room. "How could you? How could you do this to me? To us? To Ethan?" At the mention of Ethan's name, her face crumbled, and tears started streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. It just happened. That's not an explanation." I shouted, pacing the room. "How long, Laura? How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been sleeping with him?" She hesitated, her silence confirming the worst. "Over a year," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Since last spring. A year. 12 months. Over 300 days of deceit, of living a lie, of her sneaking around behind my back." I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. "And Ethan?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Is he even mine?" Her sobs grew louder, and she shook her head, confirming the truth I'd feared most. "He's Mark's," she said, barely able to get the words out. "I'm so sorry." I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. Ethan wasn't mine. The boy I had raised, loved, and sacrificed for was someone else's child. Mark's child. My brother-in-law's child. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Every moment I had spent with Ethan, every memory, every bond, it all felt like a cruel joke. "Why?" I demanded, my voice hoarse. "Why would you do this? What the hell were you thinking?" Laura looked up at me, her face red and streaked with tears. "I don't know," she cried. "I didn't plan this, I swear. It just happened. Mark and I." "Stop," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "I don't want to hear about your excuses. I don't care how it happened. You destroyed everything, Laura. Everything." She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back, the betrayal too fresh, too raw. Please, she begged. Don't do this. We can work through this. For Ethan. For Ethan? I repeated, laughing bitterly. You mean the child you lied about for 8 years? The one you let me believe was mine? She winced at my words, but I didn't care. There was no coming back from this. No fixing what she had done. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought I had, it was all gone. All I felt now was anger, betrayal, and the cold realization that I needed to get out. I didn't say another word. I walked past her, grabbed my keys, and left the house. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. That night, I drove for hours, the city lights blurring as I tried to process everything. The weight of Laura's betrayal pressed down on me like a boulder, making it hard to breathe. I felt like a fool. How had I not seen the signs? The woman I had loved, trusted, and built a life with had torn it all apart in a way I couldn't have imagined. And Ethan, my sweet boy, the center of my world, wasn't even mine. That truth gutted me more than anything else. Every memory I replayed felt warped now, tainted by the lies that had been lurking underneath. The day we brought Ethan home from the hospital, his first steps, his first words. Every milestone played back in my mind, overlaid with the crushing realization that Mark had been there too, lurking in the shadows of my family. How long had he known Ethan was his? How could they both live with themselves, letting me believe this lie? Anger surged through me, burning hot and blinding. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to make the pain stop. But even in my rage, sadness was the undertow, pulling me under. I thought of Ethan's smile, the way he'd run to me after school, the nights we spent building forts in the living room. I loved that boy more than life itself. But now what was I to him? A father? A stranger? Questions I didn't want to face kept swirling in my mind. Could I still be his dad, knowing he wasn't mine by blood? Did it even matter? Or was everything, every bond, every connection, just a lie? I pulled over into an empty parking lot, my head resting against the steering wheel. The tears came then, hot and bitter. I hadn't cried in years, but that night I couldn't stop. The life I thought I had, the family I thought was mine, it was gone, shattered. When the tears subsided, a cold, hard clarity began to settle in. I couldn't stay in that house. Couldn't wake up every morning and look at Laura, knowing what she'd done. There was no salvaging this. I needed space, distance, time to figure out who I was now that my entire world had been ripped apart. One thing was clear, I couldn't stay. Staying meant living in a lie, and I couldn't do that anymore. The decision to leave wasn't easy, but it felt inevitable. Staying would mean suffocating in the lies Laura had spun, pretending everything could somehow go back to the way it was. Deep down, I knew it couldn't. That version of my life no longer existed. The next morning, I packed a bag while Laura hovered in the doorway, pleading. Her words washed over me, apologies, excuses, promises, but I couldn't absorb any of them. I had nothing left to say. Every time I looked at her, I saw Mark's texts, Ethan's face, and the years of deception I'd unknowingly lived through. I need time, I finally said, my voice cold and detached. Time to figure out what's next. It wasn't the full truth. What I really meant was, I can't be here anymore. I can't look at you, at this house, at the life we built on lies. I walked out the door, unsure of where I was going, but certain of one thing. I couldn't come back. I drove aimlessly for hours before landing in a motel off the highway, its faded sign flickering against the night sky. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, exactly what I needed. Sitting on the edge of the creaky bed, I stared at the packed bag by the door. My entire life had been reduced to a duffel and a storm of unanswered questions. The silence was deafening. For the first time in years, I was completely alone. No Ethan running down the hall, no Laura pretending we were a happy family. Just me and the overwhelming weight of everything I'd left behind. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and loose ends. I reached out to a lawyer to discuss divorce proceedings and started planning the sale of the house. I needed to cut ties cleanly to protect myself from whatever fallout might come. Laura had already lied to me about Ethan. I wasn't going to give her the chance to take anything more. It wasn't just about leaving her, though. It was about starting over. I didn't know where I'd end up, but I knew it had to be somewhere far from the life I'd built with her. Somewhere I could finally breathe again. I spent weeks in limbo, driving from town to town, trying to find something, anything, that felt right. Most places blurred together, their streets lined with the same chain stores, the same tired faces. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I'd recognize it when I saw it. At least, I hoped I would. It was by pure chance that I stumbled into the small town that would eventually become my sanctuary. I was on a winding back road, miles from any major highway, when my car started sputtering. A flashing check engine light forced me to pull into the only gas station for miles. It was a run-down place, the kind of spot you'd expect to see in an old postcard. Peeling paint, a cracked sign swaying in the breeze, and a single, ancient pump that looked like it hadn't worked in years. The man who came out to help was in his 70s, his hands rough and grease-stained. He introduced himself as Carl, the owner of the gas station and adjoining garage. While he worked on my car, we got to talking. Carl had been running the place for decades, but his health was failing, and he was looking to sell. "You interested?" he asked, wiping his hands on an oil-streaked rag. I laughed it off at first, but the idea stuck with me. The station wasn't much to look at, but there was something about it, a potential I couldn't quite put into words. It was simple, straightforward. It wasn't wrapped in lies or complicated histories. Maybe it was exactly what I needed. That night, I stayed in the only motel the town had to offer and thought about Carl's offer. I wasn't a mechanic, but I'd tinkered with cars enough to know my way around an engine. I didn't have big dreams or a clear plan for the future, but I had enough savings to take a chance. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The next morning, I drove back to the gas station and told Carl I was interested. Over the next few days, we worked out the details. Carl showed me the ins and outs of the place, sharing stories about the customers who'd become regulars over the years. The paperwork was straightforward, and before I knew it, I was signing the dotted line, officially becoming the owner of the station. Standing in front of the place after the deal was done, I felt an odd mix of fear and excitement. This was it, my chance to rebuild, to start fresh. The station needed a lot of work, but so did I. In a way, we were perfect for each other. The gas station became my world. From the moment I signed the papers, it felt like a lifeline, something to focus on, something I could pour myself into. It wasn't glamorous. The place was falling apart. The pump barely worked, the garage was cluttered with decades of junk, and the walls were stained with years of grime. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was doing something real, something mine. My morning started early, often before the sun came up. I'd grab a cup of coffee from the diner down the street, where the waitress, Maggie, always had a kind word and a smile, and then head to the station. I threw myself into the work, scrubbing walls, repainting the exterior, replacing old fixtures, and sorting through the mess in the garage. It was backbreaking labor, but it kept my mind quiet. Carl helped me in the beginning, teaching me the ropes and introducing me to some of the regulars. "You treat people fair, and they'll keep coming back," he told me one afternoon as we repaired a car together. His advice was simple, but it stuck with me. The community surprised me. At first, I thought they'd see me as an outsider, some random guy trying to take over a town staple. But they welcomed me. People stopped by to introduce themselves, often with plates of cookies or stories about how Carl had saved them from a breakdown on a rainy night. It didn't take long for me to realize that this little station wasn't just a business. It was part of the town's heartbeat. As I worked, I started noticing the changes in myself. The anger that had burned so hot in the beginning started to cool. The sadness that had weighed me down like an anchor began to lift little by little. There was something healing about the physical labor, about seeing the results of my effort in fresh paint, clean floors, and customers driving away with smiles. One evening, after closing up for the day, I sat on the station's front steps, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a small sense of peace. The betrayal, the lies, they still hurt. But here, in this tiny town, surrounded by good people and honest work, I started to believe I could build a life worth living again. The gas station wasn't just a business. It became a bridge to the people around me. Day by day, I started recognizing familiar faces, learning names, and hearing stories. Each interaction reminded me that life could still be simple and genuine, even after everything I'd been through. Maggie, the waitress from the diner, was one of the first to truly break through my walls. She wasn't pushy, but her kindness was persistent. Whenever I stopped by for coffee, she'd make it a point to chat. At first, I gave her short answers, but over time, I found myself opening up a little. She had a laugh that could fill the whole room and a knack for making people feel like they belonged. One afternoon, she stopped by the station after her shift, holding a box of sandwiches. "Figured you'd forget to eat," she said with a teasing smile. We sat on the steps, eating and talking as the sun set. For the first time in months, I really laughed. It felt strange but good, like waking up after a long, dark dream. The town's trust grew too. People started bringing their cars in for repairs, and word spread that I was fair and thorough. I got to know the regulars: Joe, the farmer who always needed his truck patched up; Beth, a single mom with a clunky old sedan; and even old Mr. Grady, who didn't drive anymore but still stopped by to chat. Their stories, their struggles, their kindness, they reminded me that not everyone in the world was out to hurt you. And then there was Jod. She ran the hardware store on the other side of town. I met her when I came in looking for paint supplies, and she was all business at first, helping me pick what I needed. But something about her struck me, a quiet strength, a sharp wit that caught me off guard. Over time, our paths kept crossing, at the diner, during town events, or when I'd come by her store for supplies. Each time, I felt something stir in me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't ready for anything more than friendship, and thankfully, neither was she. But talking to her reminded me that not every connection had to end in heartbreak. Trust wasn't something I could give freely again. Not yet, but for the first time since leaving Laura, I started to believe it might be possible. Jod and I kept things simple at first: short conversations, quick laughs, and the occasional shared coffee when we ran into each other. She had a way of putting people at ease, with a quiet confidence that balanced her sharp humor. I found myself drawn to her in a way I hadn't expected, but I was cautious. After everything I'd been through, trust wasn't something I could give easily. One afternoon, I stopped by her store to pick up a part for the garage. It was a slow day, and we got to talking. She asked how the station was coming along, and before I knew it, I was telling her about my plans: adding another pump, fixing up the garage bays, maybe even opening a small convenience shop. She listened intently, her gaze steady in a way that made me feel safe. "You've done a lot in a short time," she said, leaning against the counter. "That's not easy." I shrugged, unsure how to respond. Compliments felt foreign to me now, but I could tell she meant it. "Keeps me busy," I said, "and out of my head." She tilted her head, studying me for a moment. "Sometimes that's all we can do," she said softly. "Keep moving forward." Her words hit deeper than I expected. There was no pity in her tone, just understanding. It made me wonder what she'd been through to learn that lesson so well, but I didn't ask. I wasn't ready to share my full story, and I wasn't about to push her to share hers. Over the next few weeks, we started spending more time together. She'd stop by the station to drop off supplies or just to chat, and I found myself looking forward to those moments. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, she helped me paint the side of the station. We worked in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't demand words but offers quiet companionship. As much as I enjoyed her company, a part of me still held back. The wounds from Laura's betrayal were still raw, and the idea of letting someone in again felt both terrifying and impossible. What if I misjudged Jod? What if I was setting myself up for more heartbreak? These thoughts gnawed at me, keeping me on edge even when I was with her. But Jod wasn't Laura. She didn't push, didn't pry. She seemed to understand my need for space, meeting me where I was instead of asking for more. It was new and strange, but it also felt right. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just surviving. I was starting to feel like I could rebuild not just my life, but myself. The more time I spent with Jod, the more I found myself torn between two worlds: the safety of solitude and the pull of something new. She was kind and steady, always showing up with a smile, and a helping hand. Yet, every time I felt myself relaxing around her, a voice in my head would remind me of Laura, of Mark, of Ethan, of how easily trust could be shattered. Jade never pushed, though, and I think that's what made her different. She seemed to understand the careful steps I was taking, as if she knew I was learning how to stand on uncertain ground again. She'd stop by with fresh coffee on busy mornings or leave small notes tucked in my toolbox. A simple, "Don't work too hard," or "The sunset's worth looking at tonight." They weren't grand gestures, but they meant something to me, more than I could put into words. One evening, after the station closed, she invited me over for dinner. I hesitated, my instinct to retreat pulling at me. But something about her patience, her sincerity, made me say yes. Her house was warm and inviting, with shelves lined with books and a kitchen that smelled like rosemary and garlic. It was so different from the sterile, tense environment I'd left behind with Laura. For the first time in months, I felt like I could exhale. Over dinner, we talked about the town, her work, my plans for the station. She asked about my past, but only gently, letting me decide how much to share. I told her bits and pieces, about leaving the city, the need for a fresh start, but I didn't mention Laura, Mark, or Ethan. Not yet. That part of my life still felt too raw, too messy to bring into this quiet, growing connection. As the night went on, I found myself laughing more than I had in years. She had a way of turning even the smallest stories into something worth smiling about. When I finally left, the stars were bright overhead, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I realized I wasn't just running away anymore. I was starting to run towards something. But the fears were still there, lurking in the corners of my mind. What if I was opening myself up to another betrayal? What if I was wrong about Jade, the way I'd been wrong about Laura? The scars from my past were still fresh, and no matter how much I wanted to move on, part of me felt trapped in that pain. Still, as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Jade, about her laugh, her patience, the way she made me feel like I could breathe again. Maybe I wasn't ready to dive into something new just yet, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure I wanted to keep hiding either. It took weeks for me to work up the courage to tell Jade the truth. Every time we talked, I felt the weight of my secrets pressing down on me. I knew I couldn't keep building something with her while keeping such a massive part of my life locked away. But the thought of saying the words out loud terrified me. One quiet evening, we sat on the front steps of the gas station, sipping coffee as the sun dipped below the horizon. Jade was telling me about her brother, who had just moved back to town, when she stopped mid-sentence and turned to me. "You've got a story too, you know," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I can see it in your eyes. Whenever you think I'm not looking, you drift somewhere else. Somewhere heavy." Her words hit harder than I expected. I looked down at my coffee cup, the warmth of it grounding me. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. But then, the words began to spill out. I told her about Laura, about the betrayal, about Ethan, everything I had kept locked away since the day I walked out of that house. I expected her to interrupt, to ask questions, to judge me for not realizing the truth sooner. But she didn't. She just listened, her quiet presence giving me the space I needed to let it all out. When I finished, I felt exposed, like I'd handed her every fragile piece of my heart and was waiting to see if she'd crush it. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and the silence stretched thin. Finally, she reached over and rested her hand on mine. "You didn't deserve any of that," she said softly. "But you're here now, and that says a lot about the kind of man you are." Her words hit me in a way I didn't expect. I felt something crack open inside me, the weight of my past starting to lift just a little. She didn't pity me. She didn't try to fix me. She just accepted me, scars and all. That night, as I watched her walk back to her car, I felt something shift. The fear was still there, but it didn't feel as paralyzing anymore. For the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could trust again. After sharing my past with Jade, I felt lighter, but the fears didn't vanish overnight. Trusting someone again felt like walking on thin ice. I kept waiting for it to crack. But Jade had a way of steadying me, not by forcing me to move faster, but by simply being there, quietly patient as I worked through my doubts. She didn't shy away from the hard topics, though. One evening, as we sat on her porch, she asked me, "Have you thought about what happens next with Ethan? Do you still see yourself in his life?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't let myself think about Ethan much since leaving. It hurt too much. But Jod's words stirred something I'd buried. The love I had for that boy, the bond we'd shared. Blood didn't change the fact that I'd been his dad for 8 years. I don't know, I admitted. I don't even know if he wants to see me, or if Laura would let me. Jod leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. Maybe it's not about what Laura allows. Maybe it's about what you need, what Ethan needs. Sometimes, moving forward doesn't mean cutting everything off. Sometimes it means deciding what's worth holding on to. Her words stayed with me long after that night. They made me realize that rebuilding my life didn't have to mean erasing everything from before. It could mean finding a way to carry the good parts forward, even if they came with pain. With Jod's quiet encouragement, I started thinking about reaching out to Ethan. It scared me. I didn't know how he'd react, or if he even understood why I left. But I couldn't ignore the pull in my chest, the need to let him know that no matter what had happened, I still cared about him. At the same time, Jod and I were growing closer. She didn't try to replace the family I'd lost or push me to rush into something I wasn't ready for. Instead, she offered me something I hadn't realized I needed, a chance to believe in the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by betrayal and heartbreak. For the first time in years, I started to see a path forward, not a perfect one, but one filled with honesty, strength, and people I could trust. And for the first time, I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Reaching out to Ethan wasn't easy. I spent days drafting a letter, unsure of how to explain everything in a way an 8-year-old could understand. How do you tell a child that the world isn't as simple as it seems, that sometimes adults make mistakes, and sometimes life gets messy in ways you never expect? In the end, I kept it simple. I told him I missed him, that I thought about him every day, and that I hoped we could talk soon. I left the letter in Laura's mailbox, unsure if it would ever reach him. It felt like dropping a message into the ocean and hoping it would wash ashore somewhere safe. To my surprise, Laura called me a few days later. "Ethan wants to see you," she said, her voice hesitant. "He's been asking about you since you left. I think it's time." I met them at a park in the city, nervous and unsure of what to expect. When I saw Ethan running toward me, his face lighting up the way it always had, I felt a flood of emotions I couldn't put into words. I knelt down, and he threw his arms around me, holding on like he never wanted to let go. We spent the afternoon talking, playing, and laughing. He didn't ask about why I'd left or why things were different now. He just wanted to be with me. And for the first time, I realized that my bond with Ethan wasn't defined by blood. I was still his dad, and he was still my son. Afterward, Laura and I had a long, difficult conversation. She apologized again, not just for the betrayal, but for everything she'd let happen. For the lies, for the pain. I could see that she was trying to make amends, and while I couldn't forget what she'd done, I felt the smallest spark of forgiveness take root. Not for her, but for me. Letting go of the anger felt like finally cutting loose an anchor I'd been dragging for too long. With Ethan back in my life and a sense of closure with Laura, I felt like I could finally move forward. Jod was there every step of the way, supporting me without judgment, helping me navigate the mess of emotions that came with reopening old wounds. She reminded me that healing wasn't linear, but it was possible. That fall, Jod and I made it official. She became a steady presence in my life, and slowly, in Ethan's as well. The three of us started carving out a new normal, one that felt more honest and solid than anything I'd had before. Life didn't magically become perfect after reconnecting with Ethan and finding a partner in Jod, but for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The gas station was thriving, not just as a business, but as a cornerstone of the small town. People stopped by not just for repairs or fuel, but for the sense of community that had grown around the place. It became a part of me, a symbol of the fresh start I'd fought to create. Ethan and I grew closer with each visit. Watching him grow, hearing him call me Dad without hesitation, made me realize that love isn't defined by DNA. It's defined by the time, care, and sacrifices you make for someone. I couldn't change the circumstances of his birth, but I could shape the memories we built together moving forward. Jad, too, became an integral part of my life. Her patience and steady support taught me that trust wasn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing to believe in the future. She made me see that scars aren't something to hide. They're proof of survival. One quiet evening, as we sat on the steps of the station watching the sunset, I turned to her and asked the question that had been on my mind for months. "Will you marry me?" Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment she didn't say anything. Then she smiled a soft, knowing smile and said, "Yes. Of course, yes." Our engagement wasn't a grand affair. It was simple, just like everything else we'd built together. But it felt right, and that was all that mattered. We celebrated with Ethan and a few close friends from town, surrounded by laughter and the kind of love that comes from shared struggles and hard-earned trust. As I stood there, watching the people who mattered most to me, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The betrayal and heartbreak I'd endured hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined me. They were chapters in my story, not the whole book. Looking back, I realized that losing everything had given me the chance to rebuild something better, something stronger. The cracks in my life had let the light in, and for that I was grateful. If I could offer any advice to someone walking a similar path, it would be this. Life will knock you down, but it's what you do afterward that matters. Don't be afraid to start over. Don't be afraid to trust again. Because sometimes, the second chance you never wanted turns out to be the one you needed all along.